Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Lizzy Baker, and I'm the Archives Lead here at Tyne Wear Archives. I'm going to start with a little bit of housekeeping as traditional. So we are live at the Discovery Museum, and we are not expecting a fire alarm test this afternoon. So therefore, if the alarm goes off, the live stream will stop and we will evacuate, and we will get back to you shortly. So we're here today because this week is Holocaust Memorial Day, which is the day for everyone to remember the millions of people murdered in the Holocaust under Nazi persecution and in the genocides which followed. Here at Tyne Wear Archives and Museums, we're running a Jewish heritage project called the Lahav Project, which aims to collect, preserve and celebrate the rich history of the Jewish community in the northeast of England, in particular in Tyne Wear, from the 1700s to the present day. And as part of that project, we've digitised around 17,000 images of archives, and we're going to be launching a new online resource called Unlocking Northeast Jewish Heritage very shortly, so that'll be in the next few months. So this afternoon, I'm going to be chatting to Professor Rebecca Clifford about her book, Survivors: Children's Lives After the Holocaust. Rebecca Clifford is Professor of Transnational and European History at Durham University. In the book, she follows the lives of 100 Jewish children out of the ruins of conflict through their adulthood into old age. Drawing on archives and interviews, Clifford charts the experiences of these child survivors and those who cared for them. This widely acclaimed account helps us to understand what it was like living after and living with childhoods marked by rupture and loss. We're going to talk a bit about her research and her book for a while. Rebecca's going to read some excerpts, and then we'll answer some questions. So if you have any questions, please ask them in the chat. So, Rebecca, thank you very much for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you so much for having me.
We're going to start off with an easy question. Can you tell us a bit about the book? What inspired you to write Survivors?
So, first of all, it's just a pleasure to be here with you today, and thank you so much for inviting me. I can absolutely talk about what launched me into writing this project that took 10 years, really, to complete in many ways. I'm an oral historian, which means I do a lot of my work through talking to people about their lives and then making sense of those conversations. And so there was an intellectual reason around the oral history that drew me into this project, and there's a personal reason as well. So the book, as you've said, is it's an exploration of what happens to children who survive the Holocaust after the Holocaust. But actually, before I started working on Survivors, I was working with a team of 14 other historians on a big oral history project on the 1960s and 70s in Europe. So it was very, very different, a really interesting and fun project. And one of the goals of that piece of research was for each one of us to go out and do about 50 interviews with people who had been involved in different types of activism in the 60s, student protests, women's movement, stuff like this. And that was wonderful. I mean, it was an incredible collection of life stories. But as I worked through doing, I think I did 53 interviews for that project, that's a lot of listening to other people's life stories. And so I started to actually also get interested in kind of the shape of a life story, the structure of that narrative. Because what's quite remarkable is there is a structure, a culturally determined structure. We all pretty much tell our life stories in a similar vein. Such unique and different lives, but the same way of telling it. And in particular, people tend to start their story in roughly the same place. So if we were doing that right now, I'd say, you know, Lizzy, tell me about your life. And you'd probably start by saying, well, I was born in X and my parents were Y. And so you start by rooting yourself in that place, in your family of origin, with the parents who created you, in the town where you grew up. And I started to think, what happens if you can't do that? What happens if you don't really know where you came from? Maybe you've got no memory of your parents, and well, you were born in a town, you've never been back there, you don't know what it looks like. If that is so crucial to our understanding of ourselves, what happens to the sense of self when it isn't there? And I started to think about what sort of a group might allow me to explore that. And I thought, well, what about children who survived the Holocaust? They so often never knew their parents. They may have no memory of the communities they came from. How do they tell the story of who they are? So that was like the intellectual path, I suppose. But I do not want to discount the personal path, which is that my mother is a child survivor of the Holocaust. So in a sense, I actually did not set out earlier in my career to ever work on this, but I have worked throughout my career on the Holocaust, and I thought, well, this is an opportunity to understand my own family better.
Yeah.
And absolutely that was the result. I feel that I understand my mother, my uncle, my now deceased grandmother in an entirely different way. And actually that was very enriching for me. So both, there are two pillars, I suppose.
Yeah, as with so many things.
Yes, it's very true, very true.
So what particularly interested you in the post-war lives of child survivors of the Holocaust?
So I suppose there's two questions there. There's the question of why I was interested in child survivors, and the question of why I was interested in their post-war lives. So I think I've probably already said a bit about why I was drawn to child survivors, but that question of why the post-war, I think, is a really important one. Because it's not just for children who survived the Holocaust. We have relatively little scholarship on all survivors of the Holocaust. To me, first of all, and this is a Holocaust Memorial Day talk, this is the right, place to put emphasis, I think, is that we can't begin to understand the lasting repercussions of genocide broadly if we don't follow its survivors through their life course. Because we know that many of those repercussions might come years later, even decades later. So we need to sort of see, okay, how do you walk out of that and go on and live your life? There is so much scholarship on the Holocaust. For a PhD student working on the Holocaust, you can never read all the books now. But the scholarship on lives after the war is relatively thin. It's growing, though. I'd say there's lots of historians interested in this now. And I really think there's so much value in putting our emphasis there because we want to understand how you go forwards and continue to live. I also think there's another side of that equation, which is many child survivors, and indeed many survivors, they are now, obviously, we have fewer and fewer survivors who are still alive. Many of them do public events. They do school talks, they do museum talks. So in that sense, they become quite good at telling their own stories. And there's nothing wrong with that whatsoever. But oral historians know that there's something really nice about a story that hasn't been told before. It can be very ruptured, it can have disjunctures in it, but there's also a raw spontaneity that's a real pleasure to listen to, if not always to tell. And so when I went to interview child survivors for the project, I often, started by saying, it's your post-war life. Feel free to tell me about what happened during the Holocaust, but it is your post-war life I want to hear about. And so many of them said, I'm not sure you really want to talk to me because I've just had a very ordinary life. I've got nothing special. You should talk to so-and-so over there. Yeah. I've got nothing to tell you. But my thinking was always, if you had such an extraordinary childhood and you've gone on to have an ordinary life, that in and of itself is miraculous. Let's talk about that. Let's talk about the ordinariness. Let's see what comes out of the conversation. And then, because many of them had not told that story before, it was fresh, it was new for me, for them. And that actually is a really nice thing when you're doing oral history. So I think both things benefit us, exploring that post-war world.
So I suppose why specifically you chose this group to look at, so those that were under 10, and I'm particularly interested in the archival and oral testimony, and those who left Europe.
So the short answer is actually the fact that there were roughly 180,000 children who survived the Holocaust. So that's obviously a very big group, and I needed to narrow it down.
Yeah.
So I did a few things early on in the project to narrow down the potential group I could talk to. The first thing I did was I made a cutoff. I only looked at those who had been born between 1935 and 1944, 45. That meant that every child of the 100 in the study, every one of them was 10 or younger at the time of the war's end. And I did that very deliberately because I was interested in that experience of a child who has been physically in continental Europe. They have survived persecution and survived genocide. They were there. So, for example, although I believe absolutely that Kindertransport children are survivors, there are no Kindertransport children in this particular book. I wanted all the children to have had the lived experience of persecution. But because they were so young, they don't always remember it. So they survived, they lived through it, they were there, but it might be very fragmentary in their minds. It might be not there at all, or some aspects might remain and some might be gone. Generally, the children in the book have no memory of their pre-war lives. So they very often, as I said at the beginning, can't remember their parents, can't remember their hometowns, can't remember their siblings sometimes. So it's just, again, getting into that idea of, okay, if you were there and you lived it, but you can't describe it, then how do you narrate your version of yourself? So that was why the very young children. In terms of the question of why I tried to combine archives and oral history, I actually think whenever we do oral history, we should always try to combine it. But that's actually quite challenging to do, because you can do oral history with people and there can be no trace of those particular people in the archives. So I took an approach where I worked the opposite way around. I looked for children, specific children, in the archives first. I found what I could. And then I tried to locate those children in the world and either interview them myself or use other existing interviews. And I just wanted to see what would come of that. Now, certainly in the discipline of academic history, you sometimes, less and less these days, but sometimes encounter colleagues who are uncomfortable about oral history because they imagine that it must be full of mistruths. People don't remember accurately. Maybe they're not telling the truth. Maybe they're going too far to justify themselves. So there's a kind of a bit of a tentative or even skeptical approach around oral history. And yet we often also, as historians, tend to really think if it's in the archives, it must be true. Yeah. Actually, what I loved about this project was how often the archival material was the one shot through with falsehoods. Yeah. And I will give you an example, but you can only see this when you take the two bits together. So a great example comes out of, you can find it in migration schemes for child survivors. So some countries ran very targeted migration schemes. So Britain did. We tried to bring 1,000 concentration camp survivor children to Britain after the war, which people listening today might have heard about the Windermere children. Yeah. That was part of that scheme. Canada, which is where I'm originally from, also had a scheme for 1,000 children. South Africa had a scheme. Australia had a scheme. There were a few other smaller ones. What's interesting is that for all these schemes, a child had to be an orphan to join. And yet, of course, many children who ended up migrating out of Europe on those schemes were not, in fact, full orphans. So what you find in the archives are these bizarre trails, I suppose, where a child appears to be an orphan, comes to Canada, and seems to have an aunt who is sort of hovering about. And as time goes by, the agency who has brought the child over, the humanitarian aid agency, starts to get a little bit suspicious about the aunt. So that's, you find references to the aunt slowly morphing into aunt in quotation marks, slowly morphing into mother because, of course, this is in fact the child's mother. This is sometimes only revealed when you can actually track down oral history or find that child themselves, obviously now an elderly person, and talk to them about it. But we can, all of us, understand exactly why a child might have lied about a living relative to get out of a really terrible post-war situation in Europe and to get some stability in a fresh start in a new country. So I love the fact that when you combine the archives and oral history, they each shed a quite remarkable light on each other. And finally, that question of choosing to look at children who left Europe. So the majority of children who survived the Holocaust left Europe and entered a global diaspora. I chose to look at that particular group of children for two reasons. One of them was practical. I was often using existing oral history collections. The largest of those exist in the United States, and they tend to be interviews with Holocaust survivors who have immigrated to the United States. So that was kind of a practical reason. But also, I was interested in what I call in the book the double dislocation of having survived something like the Holocaust. And then furthermore, being kind of kicked out into this diaspora, losing your native language, losing any connection to your original community. And again, coming back to that idea of, okay, how do you describe who you are? To lose so profoundly your links with your past just further complicates that process. So because it was the majority who went through this, I was like, okay, I need to understand how migration also affects the self-understanding, how migration affects memory too.
Yeah. Excellent, thank you. Which leads nicely to the question, the book is ultimately about piecing together a lost past. So how do child survivors make sense of their experience, and what happens when they can't?
I think very early on, very helpfully, an archivist boy, do I owe an enormous debt of thanks to the archivists who helped in this project. So many of them gave me guidance or asked me questions that changed the way I thought about what I could find in the archives. An archivist said to me early on, it's not always cathartic to speak about this past. Sometimes it's quite the opposite. And I hadn't really thought about that at that point. And so that was an eye-opening thing to be told, actually. But once I got deeper into the project, I could see how far that was true. We have a lot of expectations around Holocaust Memorial Day that a lot of survivors will tell their stories this week and next week and kind of in the couple of weeks around the 27th of January. I think as audiences, we often expect a certain type of story. We often expect it to be a linear story, to make sense, to not have too many gaps in it. I also think we don't say this, but we often expect a kind of cathartic narrative. We want to hear that you survived the Holocaust and then things got better. Often you hear survivor stories described as kind of heartwarming or something. And I have a problem with that, and I think a lot of survivors are very uncomfortable with that as well. So that wasn't what I found in doing these interviews. I found a lot of the time, it's a struggle to tell the story. And my initial impulse and hypothesis that it would be difficult to explain who you are without knowing where you come from is absolutely right. We're coming up on nearly 80 years since the end of the war. And many of the survivors, certainly the survivors whose stories I look at in this book, they are now really quite elderly. Some of them still don't know the most basic and fundamental facts about their own past. So I think probably at this point they have had to accept they will never know. And if you don't know those things, then you are necessarily going to struggle sometimes to put it all together into a coherent story. And the thing about the book is that I know that that is true for child survivors of the Holocaust, but obviously they're quite an extreme slice of a much, much more common experience, which is just to having had a chaotic childhood, having had a traumatic childhood. Well, many, many more people will have had that experience. And I always like to think that almost anyone could pick up survivors and see something of their own childhood memories in it. We all have difficult memories coming out of childhood, and have this moment to pause for kind of and reflect on how much actually fragments of our, no, I haven't said that right, disjunctures and kind of ruptures are just part of the experience of a human life. But on that note, I have an excerpt to read from the book. So this is the book, this is the paperback version, and this is just a brief excerpt from the introduction. Young children's experiences shed light on a question with profound repercussions. How can we make sense of our lives when we do not know where we come from? Because their pre-war memories were indistinct or even non-existent, and because there was often no living adult able or willing to fill in the key details of their earliest days and years, these child survivors often faced a decades-long struggle to assemble the tale of their origins, a simple but essential act of autobiography, fundamental to identity. If you cannot recount the story of your own family, your hometown, or your formative experiences, how do you make sense of your childhood and its impacts? What work do you have to do to explain who you are? Most of us take for granted that we can make at least some sense of our childhood memories. We do not often stop to think of this as privilege. At its core, this book explores what it means to grow up and to grow older when you do not have that advantage and are forced by your circumstances to weave the story of your past from scraps. It is a book about the Holocaust, but more fundamentally, it's a book about the history of living after and living with a childhood marked by chaos. And I just had a little bit more from further down the page. Most of us can tell the story of our lives from the beginning through to the present, because others have helped us to build the narrative. Our parents, families, and communities, the collective and social context in which we live, provide the details that we cannot remember or explain, and help us to contextualize memories that we hold in our mind's eye, but might otherwise struggle to interpret. The life stories of child survivors are fascinating in part because this social world was rent asunder for them. The parents, relatives, and communities that would normally play this crucial role were not there to do the job. In their absence, children were left with memories that they could not interpret, and stories of their early lives that were peppered with holes. As they grew, they had to piece things together for themselves, chasing down documents, photos, and living relatives, flung far and wide in diaspora, all in order to be able to answer the most fundamental of questions: who am I?
Yeah. So can you tell us what you think you've learned about that changing nature of memory and specifically about those issues of memory in children?
That was probably one of my favorite things about working on the book. So I am not a psychologist, obviously. I am a historian by training, although I owe an enormous debt of thanks to my mother, who, before she retired, was a psychotherapist. So I grew up in a household where we had a lot of conversations about the nature of human psychology, and that probably shows up quite nicely here. But at the beginning of working on survivors, knowing that I had to understand this, I actually went for a couple of weeks. I just sat in the library of the university and just read textbooks on child developmental psychology, which was very eye-opening, actually, and wonderful. I feel I learned a lot about child psychology in that process. And there are some really interesting mysteries when it comes to children and memory. This thing that Sigmund Freud called infantile amnesia is still to this day not well understood. And what he meant by that was the first 3 years of our lives, we cannot recall them. Many people believe that they can recall them, but it's been quite definitively shown in experimental psychology that we often think we can directly remember from this period, but we can't. We are indirectly remembering through a later memory event. To this day, we don't really understand why humans do not tend to remember their first 3 years of life. We do know, though, because there was some very exciting research done in the 1980s and 1990s by experimental psychologists. Part of the reason about why that might happen, some of the theories have to do with language acquisition, because of course we start to acquire language around the age of 3 years old. So the thinking was, well, maybe you need to be able to speak and to understand language to be able to remember, which in and of itself is very fascinating. And then that went a little further in that research to say, well, maybe it's not just language acquisition. Maybe it's learning how to use the language, how to tell the story. Because memory is so much about, it's so connected to this act of identity and self-identity. Maybe it's only when you can tell that autobiographical story that you start to, as a psychologist would say, encode the memory. Well, I think for my purposes in this book, both those things are very, very relevant. So learning to tell the story of who you are is fundamental to remembering. But of course, then what happens if you have no one to teach you? And the question of language also is very interesting because for these child survivors, they almost all of them had to switch language multiple times, losing their, birth language along the way or the language of their parents, sometimes then acquiring an extra language or even many extra languages during the course of the war, and then moving into this global diaspora where they had to learn yet another language, often English. It shouldn't surprise us then that actually many of them not only can't remember their first 3 years, it's more like their first 5 or 6 years. It's just either a kind of complete black hole or it's fragmentary. I don't think that surprises anyone. I think all of us actually, when we try to piece together you just kind of turn your gaze backwards and think about your earliest memories. They're just fragments, aren't they? You've got sort of disconnected images. How do you piece it all together? The short answer is, you don't do it by yourself. Someone does it for you. It's usually your parents. So you can go to your parents and say, I kind of remember once that I was, I did this thing or that thing. And they're like, well, that's when we went to visit your grandmother and we took you to the zoo. Someone has explained it to you. So if there's no one there to explain it to you, it always remains just a fragment. And you have to try to make sense of it on your own.
Yeah. So we've touched on this a little bit, but I suppose coming back to it, who is a child survivor and why did some children not see themselves as survivors?
There are really two parts to that question. If you break it down, there's a question of who is a child and there's a question of who is a survivor. And they're both quite complicated in their way, but there isn't a very clear-cut answer. Who is a child? Well, of course, the line that divides a child from an adult, that's culturally determined and historically contingent. It changes every time. At the end of the war, there was a great disagreement about who should be considered a child. So these schemes I talked about before, these immigration schemes, they had wildly different ideas of who counted as a child. But because I, in this book, have concentrated on children who were 10 or under, I've avoided that question to some degree. But certainly one could have a wonderful question, is an 18-year-old a child? Is a 17-year-old? Where do we draw the line? However, for this particular book, that was a non-issue, I suppose. That question, however, of who is a survivor, and so relevant to Holocaust Memorial Day, is a very difficult question with a long and fraught history. If we go back to earlier post-war decades, we find that this term survivor is used almost exclusively for people, adults, usually in this case, who survive concentration camps. It takes a much longer time for both communities of survivors and a broader world to open that definition up a little bit to include those who have other lived experiences of the Holocaust. And for adults, that might be, surviving in forced labor, surviving in different types of internment that are not concentration camps, surviving by joining the resistance or the partisans, surviving in hiding, surviving in escaping to the Soviet Union. There are lots of paths. For children, it's a little bit different because there were certainly children in concentration camps. I talk about that situation in the book. But most children survived in hiding in some capacity, a fairly different route from the adult route. And for such a terribly long time, children who survived in hiding were told, often by older survivors, well, that's not survival. You survived, you were fine, you were with a family who protected you. Let's not call that survival. In fact, if anything, let's call you lucky. I have an excerpt to read that really, I think, speaks to this better than I ever could. So let me read it to you. So this, there's two pieces to this. The first bit is a story of a survivor who's, her story features a lot in the book because it had a very great impact on me. So her name is Felice Zed. In 1983, Felice Zed was only beginning to learn who she was. The year before, at the age of 42, she had finally received confirmation that her parents had been killed in Auschwitz. The family, Felice's parents, David and Lydia, her older sister Beata, who was then aged 3, and Felice, who was 1 year old, had been deported from the little town of Waldern in the Baden area of Germany to the internment camp of Gurs in the south of France. The two small girls had been rescued from the camp by the Red Cross and hidden with French Catholic families until the liberation. Felice's parents were deported and murdered. Felice had been trying since her early 20s to trace the details of her own early years and her parents' lives and deaths, but there were still holes in her understanding. She struck up the courage to attend the first American gathering of Jewish Holocaust survivors, the largest meeting of Holocaust survivors ever held, which took place in April 1983 in Washington, D.C. Hoping to meet others with similar stories, but uncertain where her own story fitted in the broader context of surviving the Holocaust, Felice braved the criticism of older survivors who told her, "You were a child, so what do you know? You don't remember." Speaking with a volunteer who recorded a short interview with her at the gathering, Felice's frustration exploded, and this is a quote from that piece of oral history with her done in 1983. She said, "People don't understand, and it's very hard for me to talk about it. I don't belong. I didn't go to a camp. I didn't suffer in that way. There was nothing to show for it. I felt that I'm not a survivor, but then I thought, I am a survivor in my own way. My parents died. My whole family died. And besides my sister and myself, everyone is gone." We now take a broad view of what constituted survival in the Holocaust and who might call themselves a survivor. But the accepted definitions were once far narrower. For many decades after the war, a survivor was understood primarily to mean a concentration camp survivor, a category that excluded the majority of child survivors and many adult survivors as well. The figure of the camp survivor had a cultural power that was reinforced by public opinion, but was also policed by camp survivors themselves, who were not always eager to see those they had imagined had suffered less dilute the potency of this notion of survival. Child survivors had to fight not only against the external criticism of older survivors, but also an internal voice that suggested They were not really survivors, but merely fortunate kids, that their war experiences were in some way less authentic than those of camp survivors. Nicole D., who in 1991 organized the first international meeting of children who had been hidden during the Holocaust, has observed, quote, that one can never break into the hierarchy of suffering, end of quote. It's only recently that child survivors have taken on some of the roles that not long ago were the preserve of older survivors, and they will, of course, be doing those roles this week. They often speak to school students. They volunteer at Holocaust museums and exhibits. They give talks for Holocaust Memorial Day. 75 years, of course now, because this was published in 2020, 75 years after the end of the war, they have finally been recognized as survivors. And there is a clear rationale behind the shift. They are the only ones left.
Thank you. So that's my questions done. And we'd given those viewing and listening the opportunity to ask questions, so which should be appearing on the screen for us any second. So there we go. We have our first question, which was, what most surprised you in writing Survivors?
That is a great question. Thank you very much. Everything. I had to learn to do something I've never done before when I wrote Survivors, which was really tune into that surprised feeling. Mm-hmm. Because whether it was through the oral history or through the archival work, I was constantly being shocked by what I found. I mean, shocked, and I am a Holocaust historian, so I felt that I should have been ready, but I wasn't. And then I thought, good. If you're shocked by something, it's because you've assumed that the opposite must be true. So isn't it nice to have to see that your assumptions are wrong? I think as a historian, actually, that's thrilling, right? Because you know you've gone down a different route at that point. And so I started to be really attuned to that voice going, wow, I wasn't expecting this. And I can give you a particular example of where that really emerged for me. And it was around the issue of families. Mm-hmm. So in the book, there's 100 children in the book. And I'm trying to remember now, I think it's about a third of them went back to live with their family of origin. So possibly a surviving parent or possibly a surviving relative. I might be getting the figures backwards and mixed up, but it's sort of a good chunk of them get returned to family, and the rest end up in care homes, mm-hmm. which are often quite studiously not called orphanages, but we would understand them as orphanages. And all my assumptions suggested that surely of those two possible endings for a child, the better one must have been to go back to your family, because that's what we all want to believe. So I had a lot of trouble discovering that the opposite was true. And in fact, I think kind of intellectually I resisted this for a while until I'd heard enough stories to realize, to listen to what these children are saying. They were happier in care homes than they were with their families. I just think we find this very hard. We've also, if you've ever seen the Italian film about the Holocaust, Life is Beautiful, there's this bit at the end where the son comes out of Auschwitz and he finds his mother on the road and they hug. And he says, we won, because they've been playing this game. We won, as if that was just the winning scenario, was to be returned to your mother. To find that it was so often the opposite that was true was very hard to accept. But actually now I think I should have understood that from the beginning, because if you think about parents who survive, imagining what they had been through, that they themselves were really very traumatized, that they might then have had nothing to return to, no home, no furniture, no goods of any kind, no job, that they might have ended up in displaced persons camps, waiting for the next step so they can rebuild their lives. That is not a great scenario to be in with a child. It is also not difficult to understand that families were so, Jewish families after the Holocaust were so impoverished that they often couldn't care for a child. So you have some quite remarkable statistics looking, for example, at French care homes in France for children who survived the Holocaust. Quite a remarkable percentage of those children actually had surviving parents, or at least one surviving parent. At some point in the statistics, it's well over half. Wow. Yeah. And so then the aid institutions running these care homes start to ask, why can't these parents just take their children back? And of course, it's because they can't afford to. And they figure the child is better off in a place where they will have nutritious food. They will not have stressed out parents trying to manage them, but instead have a staff who will really be able to devote 100% of their energy to the children. Well, of course that makes complete sense. I'm sure that's why children experienced it in that way. Many of them found those care homes to be wonderful places where they were genuinely happy, felt genuinely loved and secure. It was the next phase where they were the kind of dispersed across the globe. That was the truly difficult phase.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Thank you. Right, we have another question. So someone's saying, really interesting talk, thank you. I'm wondering if you have come across stories of how child survivors navigated telling their stories to their own children.
Thank you so much for that question. It's actually a very, very difficult question. There isn't a simple answer. There isn't one answer. Because there's a chapter in the book about this. Some child survivors found a way to have this conversation with their children, but it was often a very, very fractured conversation because, and none of us, I think, have any difficulty understanding this, you want to protect your children, including protecting them from what happened to you. It's just a very natural impulse. So we find in some child survivor families there was a conversation around the child survivor's past, the parental past. We find in other families literally a blanket silence. The more interesting thing for me is that often there's a kind of skipping of a generation, so that many of the child survivors who I have spoken to in my research will say, I really could not tell my own children this, but I like talking about it with my grandchildren. So I'm okay because I'm not responsible for my grandchildren. I don't have to protect them in the same way. And it's so many years decades have gone by, the pressures are not the same. So I never wanted to tell my daughter, for example, but I will have this conversation with my granddaughter. I think that's very interesting. I suspect that's probably true for traumatic childhoods more broadly, because we have a kind of inbuilt reason to keep our own children safe from what has happened to us, I think. But a grandchild, it's a different relationship.
Yeah. That was an excellent question. Thank you, Abigail. Do we have any more questions? So this is a question saying, I'm interested to know if this has informed your next area of research. What are you working on now?
Oh, it has. It has so very, very much. And there's a bit of a story there. So when I first started out working on survivors, I actually had a discussion with a literary agent about the nature of the book, and I described what I wanted to do and whether I wanted to see if she wanted to take it on as an agent. She said, well, it sounds a bit academic. I don't actually think it is now. It hasn't landed on that page, but sure, maybe how I described it then. Sounds a bit academic, but if you ever wanted to write a book on a single orphanage care home, that could be really interesting. I'd be interested in that. And I thought, what a great idea. I love that idea, because there happened to be one of the orphanages that I write about quite a bit in the book, really has a remarkable story. So although I do discuss it here, I sort of hived off parts of that story, for I thought it deserved its own book. It is an exceptional care home because, not just because it has a fascinating a small group of children who survived the Holocaust, but more specifically because it operates under the patronage and the guidance of Anna Freud, who is the daughter of Sigmund Freud, but also is herself the one of the founders of the field of child psychoanalysis. So there kind of becomes this inextricable link between this little group of children who survived the Holocaust and the development of post-war child psychoanalysis. And this story of this one orphanage opens this whole world up. Child psychoanalysis takes off, especially in Britain, but globally after the war. It has a golden age in the late 40s through the 50s and 60s. And I know that other scholars have talked a little bit about how the Holocaust kind of informs psychoanalysis, and obviously a lot of the analysts themselves are Jewish, or they have themselves escaped persecution. I don't think anyone's ever looked at how deeply and intimately that link is forged through this one small orphanage. So I am in the process of writing a book about this remarkable little case. And I just, watch this spot, I suppose. I just need a little more time to finish writing it.
Okay.
As that's what we all want. So we just want a little more time.
A bit more time. So, I think that's all the questions we have. So it's just left to me to do the thank yous. So obviously, thanks first and foremost to our speaker, Rebecca, for that absolutely fascinating conversation. I've really enjoyed that. And thanks also to all my colleagues who you won't be seeing in front of the camera, but who've done all the work behind the scenes. So in particular, Alex, Alistair and Vicky for all their hard work. Thanks also to Newcastle City Council, who have provided the funding enabling us to stream this online for you to watch at home. And of course, thank you to all of you for joining us today.
Thank you.
We do run a variety of online and in-person events here at the Archives and at Discovery Museum, so keep an eye on our website for any future events. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.